The river, on the outskirts of Havenwood, had a deceptive calm about it. It meandered slowly, a ribbon of murky green between banks choked with willow and wild bramble. The old steel bridge that spanned it was a relic, scarred with rust and covered in graffiti that told a history of youthful indiscretion. To 15-year-old Lily, it was simply a part of her daily ritual. Every afternoon, after her homework was done, she and her dog, Barnaby, a scruffy loyal terrier mix, would follow a dirt path that led under the bridge, a route chosen for its cool shade and quiet solitude. Barnaby would chase stray leaves, and Lily would walk with her headphones on, lost in a world of music and daydreams. But on a Tuesday in late August, the routine was broken. Barnaby, a dog of predictable habits, stopped abruptly, his ears perked, and a low guttural growl rumbling in his chest. He wasn't looking at a squirrel or a bird. His gaze was fixed on a cluster of old, discarded pallets and tarps tucked away in the shadows of the concrete pier. A strange, metallic scent, sharp and acrid, hung in the humid air. Lily, pulling her earbuds out, followed his line of sight, her heart beginning a nervous flutter. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, clutching Barnaby's worn leash tighter. The growl intensified, and Barnaby started to pull, his whole body trembling with a mix of fear and urgency. Lily, curious but cautious, moved closer. She saw a flicker of movement, a boot sticking out from under the pile of refuse. Her mind, racing through a catalog of dangers, landed on the most mundane explanation: a homeless person. But as she crept nearer, the distinct pattern of a camouflaged uniform came into focus. A human figure was slumped against the concrete wall, head bowed. A sudden, terrifying thought took hold of her. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone was just sleeping. She called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no response. Barnaby whined, a sound of deep concern, and tugged again. Lily moved the tarp with a shaky hand. What she saw next stole the air from her lungs. It wasn't one person, but three. 3 men, lying in a heap, their uniforms torn and stained, their faces pale and gaunt. 2 were unconscious, one with his head bandaged with a ragged piece of fabric, the other with an unnatural twist to his ankle. The 3rd man, his face caked with dirt, was awake, his eyes hollowed out and staring into nothingness. They were Marines. She saw the patches, the faded insignia, the worn dog tags around one man's neck. They were young, but their faces were etched with a weariness that belonged to a much older generation. They looked like ghosts. They looked like they had been left to die. Fear turned to a primal, frantic need to act. She had no phone. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but then she looked at the men's faces, at their vacant stares and pale lips, and a wave of determination washed over her. These were not just people, they were soldiers. They were heroes, and they were in trouble. "Barnaby, stay," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady. She turned and ran, her small, athletic frame propelled by adrenaline. She didn't know where to go, who to trust. She ran back up the path, across the grassy bank, and onto the street, her mind a whirlwind of possibilities. The nearest house was a good quarter-mile away, but she couldn't wait. She ran until her lungs burned, a desperate plea for help forming in her mind. She finally reached a small, roadside diner. She burst through the door, out of breath and trembling, the bell above the door jangling violently. The handful of patrons and the owner, a gruff man named Ed, looked up at her, annoyance on their faces. "Help. Please. I need help," she gasped, leaning against the counter. There are 3 Marines under the bridge. They're hurt. I think they're dying." Ed scoffed, a look of disbelief on his face. "Kid, what are you talking about? Another one of your crazy stories?" Lily was known in the neighborhood for her active imagination, a byproduct of her quiet, solitary life. But this was no story. "I'm not lying, please. They're under the bridge, by the river. They look terrible. Like they've been gone for ages." A young woman, at a nearby table, a paramedic named Jess who was off duty, stood up, her brow furrowed. She saw the genuine terror in Lily's eyes, the way her small body was shaking. "Where?" she asked, her voice calm and authoritative. Lily's eyes met hers, and she pointed frantically in the direction of the river. "Down the path, under the bridge. There in camo, please, you have to hurry." Jess grabbed her phone and made a call, her voice low and efficient as she relayed the information. Ed, his face now pale, watched as Lily's desperate plea was taken seriously. Minutes later, the wail of sirens filled the air. Police cars and an ambulance arrived, their lights flashing. Lily led them down the path, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and relief. Barnaby, still at his post, let out a soft whine of greeting as they approached. The scene under the bridge was a mix of organized chaos. Paramedics and police swarmed the area, their professionalism a stark contrast to the quiet horror of the discovery. They gently moved the wounded men, assessing their condition. The 2 unconscious Marines were quickly loaded onto stretchers. The third, the one who was awake, was helped to his feet. His eyes, still dazed, found Lily's. He managed a weak, grateful nod, a silent acknowledgement that she had saved their lives. As they were carried away, one of the officers, a kind-faced man named Detective Miller, knelt down and looked at Lily, his eyes filled with a mix of awe and concern. "You did a very brave thing today, young lady," he said. "Do you have any idea who they are? What happened to them?" Lily shook her head, unable to speak. The reality of what she had seen was just beginning to sink in. She had no idea, and in the days that followed, the entire town of Havenwood, and soon, the entire nation, would be asking the same question. The 3 Marines were identified as Sergeant David Vance, Corporal Alex Stone, and Private First Class Mark Jensen. They were rushed to a military hospital, their conditions critical but stable. They were suffering from severe dehydration, malnutrition, and a variety of serious injuries, but the most alarming thing was that they were missing. They had been declared dead, lost in action, on a classified mission in a remote, hostile part of the world, over 3 months ago. The news of their miraculous discovery went viral. Lily was hailed as a local hero, her face plastered on news channels and in newspapers. But the praise felt hollow. Her mind was consumed not by the attention, but by the question that gnawed at everyone. How could 3 decorated Marines, supposedly KIA, end up abandoned and dying under a bridge in suburban America? The military was tight-lipped. The official story was that they had somehow survived and made their way back to the States. But Detective Miller and a small team of federal investigators knew that didn't add up. The men's injuries, their state of mind, the location of their discovery, nothing made sense. As the Marines slowly recovered, the full, harrowing truth began to emerge, piece by agonizing piece. It started with Sergeant Vance, After a week of therapy, he finally began to speak. His voice was hoarse, his gaze distant. He described a mission in a remote region, a mission to retrieve a prototype of a new, highly advanced drone technology that had fallen into enemy hands. It was a risky, small unit operation, just the three of them, dropped in under the cover of night. But their mission was a setup. They were betrayed, ambushed, not by the enemy, but by a mercenary group hired by a rival corporation. The group was led by their own former comrade, a man who had sold them out for a fortune. Their unit was not simply lost in action. They were deliberately targeted and left for dead. The ambush was brutal. They barely escaped with their lives, leaving behind their gear and their communication devices. For months, they had survived. They made a grueling journey across thousands of miles, clinging to life by a thread, driven by a fierce will to survive and to expose the truth. They traveled on foot, living off the land, dodging patrols, and using every skill they had learned in training. They were haunted by the feeling of betrayal, the knowledge that their own people had tried to kill them. They finally made it back to the US, a journey that defied all logic and human endurance. They had no money, no identity, and no way to contact anyone. They were shadows in their own country, fearing to expose themselves lest their betrayers find them. They ended up in Havenwood, a quiet, unassuming town they had passed through on their way to a military base they hoped to reach. But their bodies, pushed beyond their limits, had finally given out under the bridge. They had found the first secluded place they could and had collapsed, barely clinging to life, waiting for it all to end. The truth was a gut punch. It wasn't a story of brave men surviving the wilderness. It was a story of a corrupt military, a clandestine betrayal, and a deep, agonizing loneliness. The tears came not just from the shock of their ordeal, but from the searing pain of their sacrifice. They had fought so hard to come home, only to be abandoned. They were heroes, not for what they did on the battlefield, but for their unbreakable spirit in the face of the ultimate betrayal. The military launched a full investigation, and the story became a national scandal. The betrayers were eventually caught and brought to justice. But for Lily, it was more than just a news story. The boys under the bridge were no longer a headline. They were real people, with names, with stories, with families. A week later, Lily and Barnaby were invited to the hospital to visit them. Sergeant Vance, now on the mend, smiled at her from his bed, a different kind of light in his eyes. "You saved our lives, kid," he said, his voice stronger now. "We owe you everything." Lily just shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You're the heroes," she said. "You were the ones who didn't give up." Vance smiled, then looked at Barnaby, who was wagging his tail. "And that dog of yours. He's a good judge of character." The truth that left everyone in tears was not about the horror of war, but about the chilling reality of human greed and the heartbreaking fragility of trust. But in the quiet friendship that grew between a teenage girl, her dog, and three broken but resilient Marines, there was also a truth about hope, kindness, and the small, incredible acts of humanity that can, in the end, save a life. The bridge, once a symbol of the forgotten, became a monument to a miracle. All because a girl and her dog decided to take a walk.